All right. So welcome everyone to today's seminar. Today we are going to talk about car tuning and setups. There are multiple chapters in this seminar, and if you happen to have any questions during the seminar, please feel free to ask your question at the end of each chapter. Also, at the end of the seminar, I'm also open to hear your possible questions. So the topics we will discuss today are about when you really want to start tuning the setup, how you do so exactly, how can you judge what your car is doing, and I've listed a couple of examples of setup issues and their resolution, or how you want to solve these problems as well. And as well as I mentioned briefly, there will be a short Q&A section at the end. So again, you may ask when you should really start tweaking the setup of the car. Well, before we would answer this question, it's really important to clear the goals of car setups and tuning our car. One of these goals is fairly obvious. All of us wants to go faster, and the faster or the better setup usually allows us to do so. However, there can be other improvements made to the setup even without improving its raw speed. First, handling or safety is also an important factor, because you may have a super fast but very edgy setup that you cannot really drive around for an endurance race for hours. That might not be the best setup you want to go with for the race. A good setup helps you stay in full control of the car. It helps you build up the trust with the car so you can push it further and further. A good setup also helps you improve in consistency and repeatability. This is once again very important, so you can always do good lap times in different conditions, on various tires, or on the long run. That's just as important, if not even more important, than raw speed of the setup. There are some techniques to know that are really important prerequisites for car tuning, because changing the setup of the car doesn't usually come with as big of a difference as we may initially think in terms of lap time gain, unless your base setup or the setup you've been running up until that point is totally wrong. You really are not after multiple seconds of gains just by tweaking the setup. So what are these techniques? Now, vision is a fundamental technique you really need to be comfortable with. You want to use your vision to not only judge your apexes and exits and where you want to be looking ahead, but also using your peripheral vision, you can always check where your car is positioned on the circuit at every point on the circuit, where it's angled towards, where it's going towards, at what speed you are approaching certain spots on the circuit, how much your car rotates at every point during the lap, and how quickly it does so. So your peripheral vision is really important to be able to give good quality feedback with regards to what the car is doing. The steering is also very important, as sometimes you may think of an issue that you want to solve through the setup, but it could be a steering technique related issue, such as turning in a bit too much into corners and that causing understeer, or not turning in early enough, so essentially skipping the introduction phase of the load transfer, and so on. And then again, braking technique, especially consistency with the braking, is also super important. You need to be comfortable with trail braking and consistent with your braking points and your braking technique, because if you're not consistent enough, a certain setup change may not do you any better. It will be more difficult to judge and decide whether you want to keep a certain setup change or revert back. If you're not really sure, make sure your technique is still there. And if you double check your driving, let's say the replay mode, and you can see a lot of differences lap after lap in your braking technique, it's probably better to just revert to your previous setup that you are more used to and fix your braking consistency first. And last but not least, a technique that hasn't been discussed yet, but it is also a very good and important skill you can learn in your sim racing career is adaptation. Adaptation to the car, to what it's doing, what it prefers, how it is driven by design, and also adaptation to setup changes. If you are able to adapt to your car and to set up changes faster, then in your given free time period, you're able to make more setup changes, so you can get a faster setup. You can build a faster setup in a shorter period of time, and thus you can test it out more thoroughly. Or if your free time is limited, then this adaptation skill is very can come in handy actually. And then I briefly mentioned consistency, but what do I think of consistency, or how would I define consistency? Now, initially, we may think consistency really is about hitting the same lap time, lap after lap. However, you can still hit the same lap time, lap after lap, if you lose half a second in one corner and gain that back in the next one. That is, you can probably feel that anything but consistent. So really want to avoid too harsh, unpredictable behavior and inputs to your car, which can make this happen, that you lose half a second in one corner and you gain it back in the next one. You really want to stop doing this and first get that fixed before you would go to the setups. With regards to lap time consistency, the numbers I listed on this slide may seem a little bit restrictive. If you think about 0.5 to 1% of your best lap time, initially it seems a little bit strict. However, if you actually do the math, you will see that on a 1 minute long track, 1% is 0.6, and it's actually quite a bit of a difference lap after lap. You are very likely not going to gain 0.6 from tweaking the setup on a 1 minute long track. So if you're not consistent enough with your inputs and your lap times, then I still highly advise not really tweaking the setup, or not really tweaking it in great detail, but make sure to do some more practice and work on your consistency. This would mark the end of the first chapter. If you happen to have any questions with regards to the previous slides, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question. If there are no questions at the moment, I will then go ahead, but later on, please feel free to ask about the previous slides as well. So the next topic I would like to briefly touch upon is giving quality feedback. So what is good feedback? How would I define it? Well, you need to be conscious of what your car is doing at every moment during the driving period. Once you're conscious of what your car is doing, or what your car is not doing, but you want it to do, then you need to be able to identify the issue. And afterwards, it's going to become more important to be able to describe this issue in more detail. For instance, identifying the location or the area of the issue, or the severity of the issue, or the occurrence of the issue, such as whether you have understeer everywhere, or you have problems in high-speed corners only, or you have a problem with your car's laziness, or lack of responsiveness, and so on. So how do you do this then, you may ask? Well, first, I do suggest to get comfortable with the car and track of your choice. And by comfortable, I mean build the experience with it. Don't get too comfortable. Still keep pushing every time you're driving. and try to build up your consistency with regards to lap time and handling and technique with the baseline setup or your setup that you have been using for a while. Possibly it doesn't have to be a baseline setup, but a setup that you are more used to. Try to push the boundaries, find the limitations of the car everywhere. So every corners, entry, turning, braking, mid-corner phase, exits, and straights as well. Then I suggest to make some notes for which you can use the replay mode, which I do believe is heavily underrated. Even after 15 years of sim racing, I still regularly check my replay just to double check I'm doing everything right, or or to double check that I'm doing what I intend to do. Sometimes I leave a few centimeters on the track here and there, and I go back to the replay and check that and adjust my driving accordingly. Feel free to use the straights to think about what happened in the previous section or previous corners, because in the straight you don't have too much to think about and you can relax a little bit. Feel free to grade the severity of your problem on a scale of your choice, let's say 0 to 5 or 1 to 10. It's completely up to you. Start with very basic issue descriptions, such as identifying an understeer issue or oversteer issue. And once you're more comfortable with this, then move on to describing these issues in more detail, such as locating the area of the issue. For instance, if you have understeer on corner entries, but the rest is fine, then make sure that you only try to adjust the car on corner entries, and if possible, try to maintain the same balance and overall grip level in the rest of the phases of the corners. And in the beginning, if you're new to setup building, I highly recommend making some notes for yourself so you don't have to go through the very first steps of setup tuning every time you go into a setup tuning session. Before I would move on to how you want to tune the car exactly, I would like to ask if any one of you has any question. If so, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question. So if there's no questions, then I will move on. So how do you go on tuning the car then? It's really important to mention that, at least in case of iRacing, the weather conditions, the track usage are very important in terms of lap times and the overall grip and balance levels. So it's highly recommended to do your setups in a static session where the weather is not changing, where there is no evolving track state and so on. Because if you can factor out these inconsistencies, then you will be able to more correctly judge whether your setup changes for the better or not. If you have varying conditions which result in better or worse lap times, you will not always know whether your setup change was for the better or not. So how you can do this exactly? Well, if you use the user interface of iRacing, then make sure whatever set of conditions you use, make sure that the generate weather and the dynamic sky options are turned off. If you use the website to load the session, then you will find these boxes to turn off with the names of dynamic weather and dynamic sky. Also, I suggest using a 100% track state, because then you will make sure that the track also doesn't evolve throughout your session. Only marbles build up. Before I would move on to giving you the exact things you can work on with the car setup, I feel like it's important to at least briefly touch upon the topic of load transfer. You might have heard of this as weight transfer, or maybe load transfer as well. People tend to call this weight transfer. The difference between these two phrases or two phenomena is Weight transfer is the actual transfer of something that has weight, something that has mass, such as freely moving fluids, such as the fuel sloshing in the fuel tank, or the water sloshing in the water bottle of the drivers, and so on. Whereas load transfer is not quite that, but that's what people usually tend to mean when they say weight transfer. Now, load transfer is driven by acceleration, whether that's acceleration in a straight line or deceleration in a braking zone or lateral acceleration during cornering. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to corner if you didn't have lateral acceleration. So why this is important, you may ask? Well, this is important because the race car tires don't quite work as you may initially think. They have a so-called digressive relationship with the vertical loads they have. If you think about only this bottom left figure, then this figure tells you the relationship between the vertical load on a given tire and how much grip it can generate. The more load you put on the tire, the more grip it can generate. However, this is a dying curve or a digressive curve. So if you double the load on a given tire, you do not double the grip it can generate, but you get a bit less than double. This depends on multiple factors, such as tire manufacturer, the region you are using the tire in terms of slip angle, tire temperature, tire pressure, camber, toe, and so on. But in general, this is a digressive curve. And if you think about a static condition when the car is standing still, let's say an F1 car, which usually has a symmetric weight distribution. And if we only think about the front tires at the moment, just to make it even more simple, the left front tire and the right front tire can generate the same amount of grip because they have the same amount of load and the tire conditions are even. So if you think about the grip each tire can generate as this blue column, if you stack two of these columns on top, you get a certain amount. However, when you're cornering and you have lateral load transfer, let's say in the left-hand corner, the left front tire loses a bit of load due to load transfer, and this load goes onto the right front tire. And if you check how much grip you lose on the inside on the unloaded tire and compare it to how much you gain on the loaded tire, the outside tire, your overall grip comes out to be a little bit less than your static case. So if you add up the green and the red column on top of each other and compare it to two blue columns, you can see you get a little bit less grip from the tires. So this is why load transfer gives you less total grip on the car, on one side of the car or on one end of the car. So when we think about load transfer, this is usually the driving factor in determining your overall grip and your balance. So this might be a little bit lot to take in. So let this sink in, and if there is anything you don't quite understand about this slide or about load transfer in general, then please feel free to ask about it. So if this is clear, then let's... Sorry, go ahead.
A simplification of the four wheels of the car, no? So with four wheels, we really had four columns of friction, no? So the graph should be even more complicated according to the slip angle of the front and the rear tires, no? But that might be quite complicated, I guess.
Yeah, I am using this slide to just make it as simple as I could. If you think about four tires, you could imagine this as double of this.
Double tire, yeah.
Yeah, but usually race cars don't have an even distribution if you compare the rear tires versus the front tires together. So like Formula One cars usually tend to have the center of gravity more backwards. So there is usually more static load on the rear tires compared to the front tires. Most race cars tend to have this. So usually there is a little bit more static weight on the rear and a little bit less on the front. But this is really just to understand what load transfer means, or what load transfer is, and why load transfer reduces grip, or why it can reduce the grip.
Yeah, understood.
Okay, great. Any more questions, possibly? Feel free to ask. No stupid questions. I mean, there is no stupid question. All right. If this is clear, then let's move on. But again, if something clicks later on that you may not understand, please feel free to ask. So now we are actually going to touch upon the things you can change in the garage, in the setup. And the first things I would like to talk about are the settings that change the car everywhere during the or over the course of a lap. These are the tire pressures, the springs, and the ride height on both front and rear, and left and right. These are your tools to first touch, to first set, to set your overall grip level and your balance concept. Now, the reason I'm saying concept and overall grip levels is because there are other tools in the garage or on a car that you can adjust, but usually have a smaller impact on lap time, smaller impact on balance and overall grip levels. So these are your tools you want to first set, because first you want to fix your big issues so that then you can get rid of the issues that really hold you back, and then move on to smaller, more local issues later on. But these are tools you really want to set first. So because they have such a huge impact on overall car performance, if you manage to get rid of your big issues, such as global oversteer, so you have oversteer everywhere and you manage to get rid of it, or at least reduce its severity, you may likely introduce new issues you need to sort later on with something else. This new issue should be a lot less impactful, a lot less severe. If it's not, then you still want to make sure that you set these first and find the ideal set of these settings that help you to get rid of your big issues. Then once you have the ride heights, your spring rates, and your tire pressure set, move on to the anti-roll bars or sway bars, aerodynamics configurations, so wing levels, gurney flaps, and so on. Suspension geometry, including camber and toe, as well as the brake system, so the brake bias, brake master cylinder, ABS possibly, brake friction pad, and so on. These settings are a bit less impactful than the previous ones, as they will change the car in every phase of a corner, whereas the springs, the spring rate, the ride heights, and the tire pressures also change the car in the straights as well, not only in every phase of a corner. Again, it's important to mention that changing these, even for the better, may introduce new but lower scale issues or smaller scale issues somewhere else. Let's say you manage to get rid of your big issues, then you get rid of your remaining set of issues, and then you happen to introduce an issue you haven't seen before or you haven't countered before. It's not really pulling you back. It's more like a minor inconvenience that you would ideally like to get rid of, or at least damp down. Before I would move on to those, I just want to clear it up once again, oversimplified, how the anti-roll bars affect the car balance. So now please look at the figure on the left side, and at the moment only on the top left, and the figure of the race car. So we have a race car that has the front tires here and the rear tires here, with the center of gravity somewhere here, indicated by this black-orange field circle. In a static condition, we assume the given mass distribution of the car. So you can see it's symmetric, and this is what we have. This is the condition when the front and the rear tires can give you the most amount of grip. If we ignore aerodynamics, we only want to look at this in mechanical point of view, in terms of mechanical grip, which is affected by the anti-roll bar. Now we assume that we have a neutral car. So in the left-hand corner, and we assume there is a load transfer of 100 kilograms on the front and 100 on the rear. Once again, this is an assumption, this is an oversimplification, but this will help you understand it if you don't happen to know what the roll bar does to the car. If you add up the load transfer, you will get a total load transfer of 100 plus 100, which is, well, 200 kilograms, or you can also count it in newtons. That is more practical, but it doesn't really matter at this point. Then what we do in this corner is try to make the car a little bit more oversteery, because maybe we have a bit of understeer problem, or too much front tire wear, or temperature buildup, whatever. So what we do in this case is stiffen the rear anti-roll bar. And what it does is it changes the ratio of the load transfer between the front and the rear axle. So our total load transfer stays the same. So if you add up the numbers, it adds up to 200 kilograms again. But you have less load transfer on the front and more on the rear. And if you recall this slide, more load transfer is less grip, and less load transfer is more grip. So we increase our grip on the front axle, but we also reduce the grip on the rear axle. And this is why you get a little bit more rotation, a bit more oversteer, or a bit less understeer. If you do the opposite, so softening the rear roll bar, it will give you a similar example or a similar result, but opposite. So like you will get the opposite effect. You will have more understeer because you will have less load transfer on the rear and more on the front. If you stiffen the front, you also get more understeer, as you have more load transfer on the end of the car, you stiffen up. Once again, this is an oversimplification. This is not exactly how it works, but this is more just to give you a concept of what changing the roll bar does.
I have a question about this, because sometimes it is counterintuitive. But in this case, with the adjustment in the bar, now you got an increased adherence in the front tires according to this red line. So if you increase the adherence in the front tires, you are getting more oversteer, I guess, because the front tires have more grip and can allow you to turn more. Is that so, or am I wrong?
So, Diego, what did you say in the beginning of your sentence, please? If you could repeat that.
Yeah, what I mean is that in this graphic, you are adjusting the bars. You are getting less load in the front tires and more load in the rear tires while turning. Is that so?
I don't get more load. I have less load transfer on the front and more on the rear. But if you add up the numbers, so like in this case and this case, you have the same amount of load on the front You have just a more even distribution of this load in between the left and the right side. And the more even distribution of the load helps you to maintain more grip. And the answer for this is because how the race car tires work. Well, also road car tires work similarly, but on the road, on the street, we are usually not at the limit. So that is why it is not really important.
Okay, but so in this case, just imagine that you have a car that is understeering a lot. So your goal should be to increase load in the front tire that is going to make the turn. Is that so, or am I wrong?
With the roll bar, like by changing up the roll bar, you are not increasing the load on the front, and you are also not decreasing the load on the rear.
Yeah, you are modifying that, but I mean, if just imagine you are doing with this car, you are doing a left turn.
Yeah.
So all the pressure is moving to the tires in the right side. So you want to get a more grip in the front axle. You want to increase the adherence in the right front tire. Is that so?
Well,
you want to make the car more oversteering.
Yes.
I mean.
Yeah. So you want to make the car more oversteery if you have understeer problems, and the way you do it is not by adding more load to the front, which you could do, but not with the roll bar. So with the roll bar, you only modify the ratio of how the load transfer from the left side to the right side of the car gets split between the front and the rear. And when you have, like, if you think about, like, if you compare this case with the baseline setup, you still have the same amount of load on the front left and the front right. So 80 plus 280 is still 360, just like here, 100 and 260. It's still the same amount of total load. But in this case, there is a smaller difference between the left and the right side than in this case. And that's why you have more front grip. That's why you have more rotation.
Okay, understood.
Okay.
Yeah. Now I get it. Thank
All
you.
right, great. You're welcome.
Small question.
Go ahead, Michael.
Just a small one. With the major changes, so the changes you would make first, provided you're consistent, like you say, and you're getting an accurate reading from the car. I always found with my driving on ACC, because I don't really do too much iRacing, if I lowered the rear road height, I always felt more stability and I felt like I had more grip.
So that's that could be due to mechanical grip as well, but it could also be aerodynamic related. So what happens when you lower the rear of the car, you move the center of gravity closer to the ground, but you do this more so on the rear than the front. And what it does is that with the lower center of gravity, you have less load transfer, and less load transfer leads to more total grip. In particularly on the rear axle, you also gain a bit grip on the front, but you gain more on the rear, like proportionally, you gain more on the rear than how much you gain on the front. And thus you will have a somewhat more understeery, but more stable car. Also, this could be because of aerodynamic issues or problems. For instance, if you have too much rear right height, so a little bit too much rake is what we also sometimes call this, you may have the floor, the diffuser of the car a bit too much away from the ground, so it's not able to generate as much downforce. And also, if you have a raised rear, the splitter of the car, the front splitter of the car, gets closer to the ground, so it experiences a little bit more ground effect. Thus, you get more grip on the front and less on the rear. So again, this leads to oversteer or yeah, so too much rotation.
Thank you. That helps a little. Yep.
You're welcome. Awesome. Okay, let's move on to the next slide, which is about fine-tuning and finalizing your car setup. So at this point, you should be overall happy with your car's performance. You really are thinking about some qualifying adjustments, let's say, to make the car setup just a little bit more edgy with, let's say, the differential or the dampers, just to gain an extra few hundredths of a second per lap. Maybe not even that much, just better drivability that you can only maintain for one lap. This is when adjusting the dampers and the differential can come into place. They usually don't have a huge impact on overall car performance, more like you're adjusting the cars in its transients. So right as you are loading up one side or one end of the car or unloading the respective other side or end of the car, how it handles over bumps, and how much the differential allows the different or the separate wheels on the driven axle to rotate independently. Once again, I really want to stress on this, that this is really just more about fine-tuning and finalizing your car setup. If you still have severe issues, these are not going to help you at all, or only to a very small extent that you will not really see a big improvement in your car setup. So this would mark the third chapter of today's seminar. Please let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, I will move on to the examples I've listed here.
Just with the differential.
Go ahead.
Does that help with rotation?
Sorry again, does what help with rotation?
Does changing the differential, the preload, does that
Yes.
change the rotation?
Yes.
How?
Yes. So basically, when you increase the differential preload, then you add static extra lock into the diff. And with a more lock differential on entry, you will have a little bit more stability, a bit more understeer. The inside wheel will not spin up as much. You maintain a little bit more grip on that inside wheel a little bit. You don't let it spin up too much. And on the exit, it is basically the opposite. It gives you a bit more extra rotation on more preload. So if you have entry oversteer and exit understeer, increasing the differential preload will help. Or if you have the opposite problem, then you want to do the opposite as well. So if you have entry oversteer but exit understeer, then try decreasing the differential preload, and let's see if that is the solution. It could be, but it doesn't have to be. So like you could fix this issue with other tools, such as the roll bars, for instance. If the problem is present in low speed and high speed, the differential usually helps you a little bit more in low speed conditions, where you have where you usually have, or where you tend to have a bigger difference in the rotational speed of the inside and the outside tire. On high speed corners, the difference is usually, not always, but usually smaller, so the differential has a somewhat lower impact.
Okay.
Great.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, then let's move on to the examples of setup issues I've listed here. So our number one issue is going to be a simple global oversteer. So we assume that your car is oversteering everywhere, is endlessly wants to spin out on throttle. If you turn the wheel just a little bit on entry, you will lose the rear. So how do you fix it? Well, first and foremost, what you could do is decrease the rear tire pressures unless they are already minimum. In iRacing, we tend to run the lowest tire pressures that we can for two reasons. One of these reasons is the current limitation of the tire model in iRacing, as that lower pressures usually tend to give you the most grip, which is also true to a certain extent in real life and other sims, but they don't result, or they don't give you a penalty for running too low pressure. So you don't have punctures, for instance, from running tire pressures too low. In ACC, I'm not really driving that too often, but if I know this correctly, you do want to make sure that your tire pressures, the hot tire pressures, are in the ideal range or in an ideal value, independently on all tires. Whereas in iRacing, what we usually do is set the lowest allowed static pressures, even if the hot pressures are completely different side to side or end to end. So what you could do in iRacing then is increase the front tire pressures. However, it's not ideal in a sense that it will not improve your rear tire grip, but it will take away front grip. So essentially you are removing some of your total grip just to make sure you have less oversteer. So this is something you can do, but I advise you not to do it. What you could do, however, is change the ride height of the car. I believe Michael asked about the ride height, and basically if you decrease the rear ride height, you lower the car center of gravity, and a lower center of gravity leads to lower car, and it leads to less load transfer, and less load transfer leads to more grip. So this is how reducing the rear ride height can help you generate more rear grip, while it also helps you generate a little bit more front grip, but you gain more rear grip compared to how much you gain on the front. So that's why it leads to a bit more understeer or more stability. You could alternatively increase the front ride height, because this way you are reducing more front grip than rear grip. This is something you could do, not necessarily advised, but this is something you could do if for any reason you cannot or you don't want to drop the rear anymore. Let's say because there's a lot of curbs, bumps that a lower car couldn't handle too well, and you would run into too big of a compromise, and maybe raising the front of the car by a millimeter or two, or maybe even more, can help you get rid of a bit of understeer and still maintain good curb handling. You could also try changing the spring rate or spring stiffness of your car. A softer rear spring allows a little bit more squat on throttle, and when the car squats a little bit more, the ride height gets a little bit lower, and you have the same benefit as I mentioned before. A softer suspension also drags the tires less across the track surface, which results in less temperature buildup on the tire surface. And when you have less or lower tire temperature on the surface, you have more grip, or well, you maintain grip for longer. So that's why a softer suspension gives you usually better grip, as long as it's not too soft, because too soft can lead to problems as well, but more on that later on. Softening the spring rates give you a similar result as softening the anti-roll bars, but changing the spring rates also have an effect on ride height and thus on aerodynamics, whereas anti-roll bars do not. Anti-roll bars do not really have a big effect on aerodynamics, only on how much the platform of the car rolls. But I'm not saying it's negligible. On most cars, it kind of is. It's not really a big concern, but changing the spring rates definitely are a big concern in terms of aerodynamics point of view. For instance, you can run such a soft spring, let's say on the rear in the LMP2 car or the F1 car, that under huge downforce levels in a straight line, you can bottom out with the rear, and this will gain you drag and lose downforce, so you lose a lot of straight line performance. So you always want to check that your car is not bottoming out or is not getting too low to choke the flow under the car. And if you have the complete opposite. So you have global understeer, then try to do the opposite things mentioned on this slide. Now let's move on to our second issue, which is turning oversteer. What you could do is, similarly to the previous slide, if none of those help, then you could try to change the anti-roll bar. You have two options, such as stiffening the front or softening the rear. They will result, or they will give you a very similar result, is that it changes up the ratio of the lateral load transfer front to back. With a stiffer front or a softer rear, you have more load transfer on the front, so you have less grip on the front, and less load transfer on the rear, so more grip on the rear. Also, as I mentioned briefly on the spring rates, softer suspension on the rear drags the tires across the tarmac or the track less, and this helps you maintain somewhat lower tire temperature buildup. What I forgot to mention on the previous slide is if you stiffen or soften your spring rates, you will likely see a change in ride heights. So make sure that if you change your spring rate, you reset your static ride heights with either the spring perch offset or the push rod length offset or whatever you have in your respective sim. Make sure you still run the same ride height, or at least very close to it. Obviously, the ride height changes a lot when driving, but you want to make sure that you're only applying one change at a time. You're not changing the spring rate and the ride height at once. Ideally, you only want to see if changing the spring rate only without changing the ride height too much helps. And if you feel like that changing the spring rate and the ride height, then you don't necessarily have to reset your ride heights. Let's keep
May I have a question?
Sorry, go ahead.
May I have a question, please?
Of course.
Would you recommend to make asymmetrical changes in the setup, or for a road cars every time have the car symmetrical?
Well, if the question is about iRacing, then I would suggest to start with a symmetric car first. And if you feel like you want some crossweight or different spring rates on different sides of the car, then so be it. If it helps you be faster or safer or more consistent, then yes, definitely. You don't necessarily have to keep it symmetric. However, I see most of the setups, not all of them, but most of the setups being symmetric. I've seen a lot of very fast setups that were actually not symmetric. They had quite a bit of crossweight and different setup on the two sides of the car. It definitely can help. In the beginning, I suggest to keep it symmetric. So just you see how changing one thing, but on both sides, affects the car. So to how much it does it and to what extent. And then when you are a bit more experienced, or when you are super close on the limit and you are testing out, you're doing some trial and error to see if, okay, if I keep this side of the car this soft, but I stiffen the other side on the same axle, then how will the car react? And in some cases, it can help. For instance, on oval, it does help, but it can also help on the road. A practical example on this is I'm doing a setup for the LMP2 car at Road Atlanta, and a little bit of crossweight can help me rotate better in right-hand corners because I needed a bit more rotation in right-hand corners, and I needed a little bit less in the left-hand corners. So I added a bit of crossweight. I went with an asymmetric setup.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So let's move on to our third issue, which is actually the same as the second issue, but we want to sort this out with something else. Let's say we are happy with our roll bars, spring rates, ride heights, and so on, but we still have a bit of turning oversteer. So let's try to solve this by changing the suspension geometry, including the toe angle. So if you don't know what toe is, try to look at this figure. when you the car is heading well upwards, so the front tires are here, the rear tires are here, and we are going upwards in this direction. And if the tires are facing towards each other, so that if you lengthen these arrows in your mind, they do meet in the distance, that means you have toe in. When they are parallel, you have zero toe, and when they point away from each other, you have toe out. Toe out also means negative toe in. And if you have turn in oversteer, you could do two things. You could try increasing the rear toe in, as that usually helps you to reduce oversteer based on how it manipulates the slip angle on different sides of the car at turn in. And you could also try to increase the front toe in. The reason I'm mentioning rear toe in first is because rear toe usually has a higher impact on overall car balance, as they are not steered, and you can change the front grip or how much rotation you get a bit more directly with the steering wheel on the front, but a bit less directly on the rear. So that's another reason why rear toe has a higher impact on the car. So if for whatever reason you don't want to change your springs, ride heights, tire pressures, anti-roll bars, but you have some turn in oversteer, then first tune your rear toe and then tune your front toe. Then let's keep the issue the same, but again, for any reason you don't want to change the toe, you want to solve your issue with changing the camber. Now, let's understand what camber is first. So please only think about these figures now. Ignore this one and ignore these two as well. So here, the chassis of the car is not represented, but you could imagine the chassis being here next to the shock absorber and the suspension arm. You have negative camber when the top of your tire is closer to the chassis than the bottom of your tire. We sometimes refer to this as the tire leaning towards the chassis. And when you have positive camber, it's the opposite. The top of the tire leans away from the chassis and the bottom is closer to the chassis. This is when you have positive camber. We tend to run negative cambers even in on a static car on road racing, because of how it manipulates the contact patches shape during cornering. When you're cornering and there is body roll to the left or to the right, the outside tires, which are the loaded tires, usually get a bit closer to zero camber, as the negative camber is being a little bit reduced as the body rolls onto that tire. And this changes up the shape of the contact patch to a more ideal shape, where the tire is able to generate more grip. Whereas on positive camber, it is the opposite. So if you look at these figures now, in this static picture, we have this green area highlight or bounded with the black line. You can see it's the same shape, just mirrored. But when you are cornering and the tire is being loaded, the contact patch's shape is somewhat more even, more regular shape, as opposed to having positive camber, where the shape is a little bit less ideal for grip generation. The total area of the contact patch remains the same for whatever camber you run, but its shape is more ideal with negative camber. This figure on the right also represents this, but quantitatively, so with numbers. You can see there's multiple lines on this, but let's only look at this green one in the middle and ignore the rest for now. So on this figure, you have on the horizontal axis the camber angle in degrees, and on the vertical axis you have the lateral force or the lateral grip a certain tire can generate for a certain camber angle. So for instance, if we look at this green line here, we can find for a given tire what camber angle we should run for maximum grip generation. You can see the peak is marked with this red dot. what I want to show you with this figure is that the ideal camber angle depends on the vertical load the tire experiences. So if you have more load on a set of tire or on a tire, you may have to run a bit more camber angle to achieve maximum grip, as the maximum grip increases slightly. It is only true for a given tire, but this, I mean, these exact numbers are only true for a given tire. But the tendency is that with more load on the given tire, a bit more camber is more useful. Again, that's something you may want to account for is tire wear and temperature buildup, and also how much body roll you have. On stiffer cars like the F1 car or the prototype car, because we usually have less body roll, we also should probably run a little bit less camber. Whereas on GT cars, which usually tend to roll a lot, probably more static negative camber helps. With regards to tire temperature and tire wear distribution, this is something you may want to look into on ACC, I believe. But on iRacing, maximum negative camber is what we usually tend to run, because this is basically just the fastest way around. Not all the time, but most times we are running maximum camber that the simulator allows us to, because there is no real downside to not running to running maximum camber. So this is something you can actually just set and forget, but I wanted you to understand the concept or the fundamentals of what camber means and what it does to a car. Now, moving on to our fifth example, which is about the pool change of direction of your car. So at this point, so if you have this problem, if your car feels good in terms of balance, but it's a little bit sluggish, it doesn't quite respond well, it doesn't react immediately or as fast as you want it to, you could try to stiffen the anti-roll bars, as these usually speed up the load transfer. So the load transfer takes less time and your car settles faster and you have grip earlier. It doesn't have to change up your balance. So you want to do this with keeping the balance in mind. If you stiffen one side or one end of your car, make sure you stiffen the rear by the same or by roughly the same amount, so you don't move the balance around, so you don't get more unwanted over or understeer, but you only make the car a bit stiffer and a bit more responsive. And now coming into our second to last issue, which is on-throttle oversteer. First, look at the previous slides and try to make sure you get rid of this issue with the previous settings, such as changing the roll bar or the toe angle or camber or ride height and so on. And if you still have this issue, then try changing the differential. I believe I described this briefly to when Michael asked about it. So basically with a more open diff with less differential preload, you get less exit locking, and that leads you to a little bit less oversteer, or in other words, more exit understeer. On multiple cars, you're also allowed to change up the assembly of the differential, or well, these numbers refer to certain angles on your differential buildup. And with a lower number, you get more locking, as that's a more aggressive diff. With a higher number, you have less locking, and with less locking, you have a bit more understeer. Once again, I want to stress that this is really mostly useful in low-speed corners and when finalizing your car setup. This is something I usually not kind of forget about, but I don't usually play around with the diff too much in the car I'm driving, which is usually the LMP2 car or the GT3. I usually tend to run reasonably high differential preload. Don't be afraid to even max it out if that's what you think will help you. Don't be afraid of using the extreme ends of the allowed settings. Give it a shot, and hopefully it helps you. And at last, our last issue is high speed related. So if you have high speed oversteer, you have two choices to make. You could try to reduce your front downforce by decreasing the front wing's angle of attack or the number of front wing elements, end plates, and so on. You may take off gurney flaps or decrease their size. Or alternatively, you could increase the rear downforce by doing the complete opposite on the rear end. Now, the way you want to judge or decide which you should do is think about your straight line performance. If your straight line performance is already good enough, and with an extra bit of drag, you wouldn't suffer too much, let's say during battling, then feel free to increase your rear downforce and keep your front the same. However, if you have straight line performance problems already, let's say you don't quite have good acceleration or top speed, then instead of increasing the rear downforce to get rid of high speed oversteer or at least reduce it, then instead of increasing the rear downforce, reduce the front until you reach the desired balance and you hopefully gain a little bit straight line performance. What's important to mention is that the rake of the car, so the right height difference between the front and the rear of the car, also has an impact on high speed performance. Usually a car that is lower on the front and higher on the rear generates more front downforce and less rear, as opposed to a car that is high on the front and low on the rear. So the ride heights do have an impact on aerodynamic performance. It's not only the wings, but also the underfloor of the body and the splitters height from the ground that has a huge impact on overall aero performance and balance. So to sum up today's seminar, before we move on to the questions, remember the consistency before tuning the car setup. Make sure your lap times are consistent on a 5, 10, 15, 20 lap run, at least to 0.5 to 1%, not really more than this, because that's already a little bit too much. Then once you got that done, make sure you give yourself honest feedback. So don't do a certain setup change or don't run a certain setup just because someone said so, just because someone said it's faster. Always make sure that you try it out, be honest with yourself, get used to it, spend some time with the setup, and only after make your judgment. When you have issues, list them, detail them, describe them, and then fix the big ones first and then move on to more local, more minor issues. And then again, mind that this may include some try and error, since iRacing is still a line of code, just as is ACC rFactor 2. And these are programs, these are written by people or humans, and we tend to make some mistakes here and there. And what I want to say with this is that always make sure that whatever you change on your car setup actually reaches what you wanted it to, what your intentions were. Always confirm that the change does what you expect it to do before believing it, without thinking about it. Something could be misprogrammed or miscoded, which actually happened just a few times on a few occasions. Let's say with the Indy Pro 2000 car, when it got released, it had the rear toe settings the other way around. So if you increase the toe in on the garage, you actually increase the toe out on the car. So this is usually fed back to iRacing, and they usually fix it in a couple of days, weeks, months, whatever time they take. But what I really want to get through with this is make sure that you do a setup change that actually does help you. So this would mark the end of the topics I wanted to discuss. And if you happen to have any questions, then please feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question or put it into the chat box.
Yeah, I have a question. Thank you very much. This was a wonderful presentation, but it is a lot of information. It is overwhelming, honestly. So I'm not a mechanic, and many of these things sounds Chinese to me. So,
oh, good.
But it is fascinating. So I would love if you could recommend us some book or some material to study and learn about these parameters, both what they are, how they behave, and then how can we adjust them. not only, of course, in sim racing, but also in real racing, because I'm quite interested in this topic. But unfortunately, my knowledge is limited, and I think that I have to learn a lot. So could you recommend us something to learn this better?
Actually, I am going to be completely honest with you. I'm a lazy person and I don't really like reading. I usually like to get as much information as quickly as possible. So I usually watch videos instead, which also have with graphical demonstrations. But with regards to books, I actually cannot tell you any right now, but I can do some research and I'm more than happy to send you via email or Discord on what you could possibly read about race car physics. I feel like there's also a lot of very good videos that help you understand a bit faster, opposite to textbooks, but textbooks also contain very good and valuable information that is not always represented in videos. So Diego, I will make a quick note for myself and I will do a bit of research and send you the books I feel like is worth a read.
Books or any material, this fascinating, I think. I'm sure it's not going to make me faster, at least in the beginning, but definitely will make me understand better the behavior of the cars, and both in real and sim racing, and learn how to adjust them and understand them better.
Awesome. Yeah, I do hope so. I hope, and I'm happy that I sparked a bit of interest in this as well. Again, we had 1 hour. I tried to go through as many settings in the garage as possible. Obviously, we cannot go too much into detail on these, and probably any more would be too much information to digest at once. So so yeah, I will send you some sources that you could take a look into and see how you like it.
Could you please write it into the Discord so everyone can have this information, please?
Of course, yes, absolutely, absolutely. So I will also send this out via email. Whoever pastes their email address in the chat box, but I will also put it into the student information Discord channel.
We also get to keep the seminar, don't we? Because the seminars get emailed out.
Yes, yes.
So we
exactly.
have that as a record. So
yes.
technically speaking, this brilliant seminar where you're going through everything, we can actually then use it for reference, effectively like a book or a video.
Yes, you could indeed, Michael. Yes. Not everything that I mentioned today applies to every car. It's more like a generalization of most race cars. For instance, the LMP2 car usually runs fairly low on the rear to generate good amounts of downforce, as opposed to, let's say, a GT3 car, which tends to prefer very high rake, very high rear ride height. I try to make this as correct as possible for as many cars as possible. But if you try something I suggested today, it might not directly help you for your car of choice. If it's a reasonably special car. Most cars usually go by these physics, though.
Just referring to more like GT3 or GT4.
Yeah,
because
yeah, I
But
believe most of this is still true and up to date on the sim.
Yeah, because some of what Scott does with his videos are very simple, and I found them a little bit more effective. But then this gives you that little bit more detail, not over elaborating, but just a little bit more detail. So it was good in that respect.
Awesome, thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, go ahead, Dave.
No, I'm sorry. When you're making these changes, is there a good baseline to start with, or is it mostly, well, I'm getting excessive oversteer or excessive understeer, so I'm just going to try a little bit and see what works? Like, is there a method or something, or just kind of trial and error?
To a certain extent, it will be trial and error. And to give an answer to your original question, iRacing has baseline setups for every car. If you have access to setup shops, then you may also take a look at those setups. You can try those as your base setups. And yeah, when you have oversteer issue with a certain setup, then feel free to go through the steps I mentioned today.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So I can see that Glenn put in very good books indeed. So Race Car Vehicle Dynamics by Douglas and Millikan are definitely good reads, but they could be a bit overwhelming actually for the first read.
Yeah, I would agree. They're very detailed textbooks, but they go into tons of detail, lots of
Yeah.
images. And unfortunately, the first 4 or 5 chapters are literally just about tire dynamics.
Yeah. Oh, you actually said that on the chat. Sorry, I didn't scroll down all the way.
Something that begins or ends like for dummies would be nice for me.
Okay, all right. Yeah, I may include some videos as well. You may find on YouTube. I believe there's a fairly good 90-minute video you may watch in maybe segments or over the course of multiple days. That's what I did as well. I usually cannot sit down for too long at once, so I just split it up for multiple days. Okay. Hi, gentlemen. I believe we have time for one more question. All right, then if there's no questions, then I would like to thank you for tuning in today. Hope you enjoyed the seminar, and I hope you enjoy the course as well. If you happen to have any questions or feedback to us after the course, please feel free to reach us via customer service or me privately via email or Discord. Feel free to use the email address I sent out the invite link for today's seminar. And yeah, really hope you could learn a thing or two from today's seminar as well as the course. And if you would like to stick with us for some further training, then feel free to head over to our Sim Racing Academy site, where you can keep progressing with your driving skills and theoretical knowledge, and improve your lap times and so on.
I signed up for the I think it was the Academy. I think it's like a monthly thing. Is there anything in particular that would be useful for the ACC side? Because I know it's more iRacing based.
Yeah, we do have regular ACC group sessions each weekend. I don't know the exact dates on the top of my head, but I believe there are three sessions. Sorry.
There's the group sessions. I think, is there setup sessions in there if you wanted to do a setup, like with an engineer?
Yeah, I do believe Jordan Sherat is doing ACC setup sessions, but again, I can't quite recall when it is.
No, that's fine. I won't take any more of your time. Thanks very much.
No worries. You're welcome.
All right.
All right then. I wish all of you a great remainder of your weekend. Good luck on the virtual track and also on the real track. If you happen to do some real racing, enjoy it and hope to see you soon.
Thanks.
You, bye-bye.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very well explained.
Thank you. Goodbye, guys. Bye-bye.